She thought she was marrying a disabled man, someone without great prospects, just to guarantee her own family survival. A cold contract, an agreement without love. But the moment the groom removed his mask at the altar, her world collapsed. Before everyone, the invalid man revealed himself to be the most powerful CEO in the city, the same one who had broken her heart years ago. And in that instant, she realized that nothing was what it seemed. The marriage that began for money was about to transform into the most intense and unexpected story of her life. Because sometimes fate disguises itself as tragedy just to teach us the true value of love. The hall was filled with golden lights, white flowers and curious gazes. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could prepare her for what was about to happen. When the man before her, until then wrapped in mystery and silence, brought his hands to his face and removed the mask that hid his features, the air seemed to vanish from inside the church. Time froze. The music ceased. The guests, in shock, exchanged silent looks, while she felt her legs tremble as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. The man who should have been a stranger, someone without shine, without health, and without a future, revealed the most familiar and, at the same time, most painful face of her history. It was him. The same gaze that once promised her eternal love and, afterward, disappeared without explanations. The man who was the center of her youthful dreams and the author of her greatest heartbreak. Her mind spiraled, tried to understand how fate could be so cruel and ironic. He, the supposed disabled man, was now the most powerful and coveted CEO in the city, a man feared in business, admired by the press, and who now stared at her with a cold, calculated smile, like someone observing a carefully orchestrated plan come to fruition before everyone's eyes. There was something almost theatrical about that scene. The people, paralyzed in their seats, watched in silence, not knowing whether to applaud, whisper, or just wait for the next act to show that seemed too unreal to be true. The young woman tried to maintain her composure, but her throat was closing. Her heart, out of rhythm, pounded with an almost painful force. The man before her wasn't just a figure from the past. He was a living memory of who she was and what she lost. It was as if time had decided to play with fate, bringing back, at the most improbable moment, the only person she swore she would never meet again. And there he was, imposing, standing, with the bearing of someone who dominates the world and the expression of someone who knows the effect he causes. The priest, confused, looked from one to the other, without understanding the cutting silence that settled in the environment. The guests exchanged uneasy looks, trying to guess the reason for the tension. Some whispered that it seemed like one of those exciting soap opera stories, where nothing is what it seems. But the truth is that it was real, painfully real, and she was trapped inside a plot that she would never have the courage to write for herself. And it was at that instant that she felt something break inside her. On the outside, the white dress shimmered, the bouquet of roses remained firm between her fingers, and the veil fell delicately over her shoulders. But inside, she was in ruins. Memories came like flashes, the simple days, the shared laughter, the gentle touch of his hands, the promises made by the lake that now seemed as distant as an old dream. He had always been her first love, but also her first great trauma. And now, there before everyone, he revealed himself as the man behind the mask, the mysterious millionaire who promised to change her life forever. It was too cruel to be coincidence. And even so, she couldn't look away. For a moment, time seemed to curve between them, as if everything they lived before was about to repeat itself, but in a completely different way. She, now in the midst of a crowd that judged her in silence, was the center of a ceremony that seemed more like a test of emotional resistance. And in the subtext of that encounter, something insinuated itself. Perhaps that marriage was more than a millionaire contract. Perhaps it was the beginning of a lesson that fate, merciless and wise, was about to teach them both. She never imagined she would accept something like this. The contract arrived on a gray afternoon, when the rain seemed to beat angrily against the windows of the small apartment she shared with her sick mother and younger brother. The proposal was too absurd to be real. Marry a supposedly disabled man, confined to a wheelchair for a period of 12 months, in exchange for $5 million. At first, she thought it was some kind of scam, a cruel farce designed to test the naivety of desperate people. But as she read the clauses, she realized it was all legitimate, drafted by real lawyers with signatures, seals, and witnesses. The amount would be deposited in installments, and she would have to live under the same roof, fulfill social obligations as a wife, and maintain the appearances of a true marriage. With each line she read, her heart tightened a little more. The money would solve all the problems. Her mother's treatment, the debts that accumulated like mountains, the overdue rent, and a humiliating feeling of helplessness that haunted her daily. Still, something in her hesitated. Marrying for money seemed like a betrayal of her own principles, a moral surrender that wounded her dignity. But life rarely offers fair choices. And when pain squeezes, pride becomes a luxury too expensive to sustain. In the days that followed, she reflected incessantly. The proposal wouldn't leave her mind. She remembered the firm voice of the lawyer who approached her. "You will be very well compensated. The gentleman doesn't want a wife for love, just for appearance. Your role is simple. Accompany him to events, smile when necessary, and keep the contract secret." Those words echoed in her head night and day. What was wrong with accepting? It would just be a cold agreement, an exchange of conveniences, something that many wealthy people did in silence and never admitted. When she finally said, "Yes," the lawyer just smiled, as if he had expected that answer from the beginning. Everything was organized within days. The dress, the ceremony venue, the ring, the photographers. There was no time to dream, nor to hesitate again. It was a marriage without love, but with an expiration date and a defined price. Only what she didn't know, what no one knew, was that behind that proposal hid a meticulous plan, fed by resentment and wounded pride. The man who pretended to need her was about to use that marriage as a stage for a silent revenge. He wanted her by his side, but not as a companion, but as a living reminder of the past that she, unknowingly, had destroyed. On the wedding day, she woke up with a heavy heart and an inexplicable feeling of emptiness. There was no joy, no expectation. There was only the feeling of being dragged by a current of decisions she could no longer control. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The impeccable makeup, the elegant hairstyle, and the luxurious dress were armor, a disguise that hid the vulnerability of a woman who no longer believed in love. Upon entering the church, she felt all eyes turned to her, some full of curiosity, others of judgment. For many, she would be just another gold-digging young woman, willing to sell her own soul in exchange for wealth. But no one knew the truth of the pain, the urgency, the desperation that led her to that decision, and much less of the cruel irony that awaited her at the altar. Because the man behind that contract wasn't just any stranger. He was the same one who, years before, had loved her intensely and then disappeared without leaving a trace. He knew who she was. She, however, had no idea that she was about to marry the past, and that by signing that contract, she was sealing not just a financial agreement, but the beginning of a story of redemption, revenge, and feelings that neither of them could control. The first night after the wedding was silent, heavy, wrapped in an almost suffocating atmosphere. She walked through the corridors of the immense mansion, with the distant sound of rain beating on the windows and the echo of her own footsteps serving as company. The air seemed dense, charged with an energy that oscillated between mystery and discomfort. There was something strange about all of it. The way the servants looked at her, the way the doors closed softly behind her, and mainly, the absolute silence coming from her husband's room. He remained there, motionless, supposedly weakened, watching her with an enigmatic, almost indecipherable gaze. It was as if each of her movements was carefully analyzed, as if he studied the slightest gesture, the slightest deviation of her gaze, trying to decipher who she had become after all those years. She, not knowing who he really was, only felt a growing discomfort. Something inside her whispered that this man wasn't who he claimed to be. There was a strength in his gaze, an invisible dominance that didn't match the fragile image of a man trapped in a wheelchair. And even so, he remained there, silent, watching her with the calm of someone carrying a secret too big to be revealed. The following nights weren't different. She tried to adapt to the new routine, but the mansion seemed alive, as if it breathed along with her, testing her emotional resistance. Sometimes, she woke up with a feeling of being watched, even when the room was empty. Other times, she saw shadows passing through the corridors, light footsteps that faded before she could confirm if they were real. Her husband rarely spoke, but when he did, his words had a strange weight, a tone of veiled irony, of silent provocation. "Are you comfortable here?" he asked one night, with an almost imperceptible smile. "I hope the marriage is meeting your expectations." She responded politely, avoiding confrontation, but felt the cold rise up her spine. There was something in that voice, something familiar, that awakened dormant memories. And, little by little, the memories began to come. Fragments of an old love, of laughter shared under the sun, of promises made under the moonlight. But she pushed those thoughts away like someone fleeing from a ghost. After all, that man was just a stranger. Or that's what she wanted to believe. However, with each look, with each word from him, a greater discomfort settled in her chest. The discomfort of someone who feels the past knocking at the door, even when trying to keep it locked. It was on a Sunday morning that the veil of mystery began to tear. She entered the study to leave some documents and saw, on the desk, an old photograph, yellow by time but unmistakable. In it, two young people smiled embracing by a lake. One of them was her, the other, that man who now claimed to be named Michael. The shock was immediate. The air disappeared. The floor seemed to spin. She brought her hand to her mouth, trying to contain the scream that threatened to escape. That photo left no doubt. The mysterious husband was, in reality, her first love, the same one who disappeared without leaving a trace, the same one she believed had died in an accident years ago. Questions stumbled over each other in her mind. Why did he pretend to be someone else? Why hide his own identity? And, more cruelly still, why approach her precisely like this, through a cold and humiliating contract? It was then that she heard footsteps behind her. When she turned around, he was standing in the doorway, looking at her in silence, with that same enigmatic smile that mixed pain, anger, and satisfaction. "Now you understand why I chose you," he said in a low voice, almost whispered. And at that instant, she realized it wasn't chance that brought her there. It was fate, or perhaps revenge disguised as love, that decided to reunite them again, in a way that neither of them could imagine. Behind the calculated smile and impeccable posture, there was a storm of feelings that no one could imagine. He had grown up surrounded by wealth, but also by suffocating expectations. Every decision in his life seemed to be directed by a cold logic of profit and convenience, and never by genuine affection. From a young age, he learned that his own family saw him as a chess piece, someone who could be moved to guarantee contracts, alliances, and reputation. Marrying for convenience had never been his desire. But upon realizing that there was a woman willing to accept marriage just for money, the idea of using that contract as a test became irresistible. He wanted to see the truth, discover if someone would be capable of seeing him beyond what he appeared to be, if someone would be capable of loving without thinking about status or fortune. And she, the young woman who entered his life carrying a past he couldn't forget, seemed to be the perfect candidate for that silent experiment. He hated the superficiality of the world around him, but at the same time, he needed her, even if indirectly, to finally prove something to himself. During the first days of living together, he remained distant, rigid, almost inaccessible. It wasn't indifference, but a calculated, almost cruel test. Each of his words was measured, each gesture studied. He didn't want wealth or her need to influence her behavior toward him. He watched her in silence, hidden behind his apparent wheelchair, studying not only the words she said, but the way her eyes moved, how her body reacted to tension and doubt. It was a silent game, an emotional chess match that could last months or even years, and in which he had infinite patience. After all, he wasn't just looking for a wife. He was looking for proof of authenticity, a true love disguised as necessity. He knew that life had taught him hard lessons about trust, about abandonment, about falsehood, and that, perhaps, this was the only way to discover if someone would be capable of loving him without knowing who he really was. Meanwhile, she, unaware of his plan, tried to navigate through the whirlwind of emotions that the new life brought. She was afraid, but also hopeful. She felt anger and frustration, but tried to maintain composure before the guests, before the family, and mainly before him. Each look, Each gesture of the mysterious husband seemed loaded with invisible secrets. The discomfort grew, the tension increased, and even in silence, he transmitted a presence that dominated any environment. She didn't understand the reason for so much coldness, nor could she guess the thoughts behind those attentive eyes. But as much as she wanted to push away curiosity, something inside her said there was more than it seemed, that he wasn't just a distant stranger, but someone who carried secrets and deep intentions. And while trying to understand that man and his behavior, the certainty that nothing was by chance began to emerge, preparing the ground for revelations that would transform everything she believed about love, trust, and truth. The marriage unfolded like a movie scene where each movement was carefully rehearsed, but no one seemed to have coordinated the feelings that emerged behind the masks. The hall, decorated with exuberant flowers, sparkling chandeliers, and impeccably arranged tables, exuded perfection and wealth, but each detail seemed to accentuate the distance between the newlyweds. He remained motionless, his eyes fixed on some indefinite point ahead, avoiding any eye contact, as if each look could reveal something he wasn't yet ready to show. She, on the other hand, felt the weight of all eyes on her. The whispers of the guests cut through the air, wounding her self-esteem. How can someone so young and beautiful sell herself like this? The phrase echoed, not only in the mansion's corridors, but inside her own mind, reminding her of the sacrifice she had made, the shame she felt, and the desperation that brought her there. Each forced smile, each polite gesture, was a struggle to maintain composure, while the urge to cry threatened to explode at any moment. She noticed that, despite his physical distance, there was an electric tension in the air, something that couldn't be ignored. He didn't need to look at her for her to feel the intensity of his presence. The way he remained motionless, contained, revealed more than any gesture of affection. It was a silence loaded with meaning, an invisible barrier between them, but also a test. Each instant that he ignored her existence made her wonder if someday he would truly see her, if someday he would be capable of trusting her. She remembered all the stories she had heard about arranged marriages, about relationships moved by money, about people who fake love just to achieve benefits. But this was different. There was something deeper, more real, even if hidden behind that cold and distant facade. Each look she diverted to him carried a mixture of fear, longing, and curiosity, because despite the coldness, there was an inexplicable feeling that this man knew parts of her that no one would ever understand. Deep down, she knew she was there for a much greater reason than the apparent one. She needed the money. She needed to save her family and honor her own survival. Each swallowed tear was proof of resistance. Each forced smile was an act of silent courage. Even surrounded by luxury and curious looks, she felt alone, as if she were walking on an invisible thread over an abyss of uncertainties. And even so, there was something that began to change inside her, a seed of patience, a timid curiosity, a careful observation of each of his gestures, of each unspoken word, of each silent movement. She didn't know it, but he also watched her, studied, analyzed each reaction, each hesitation, each attempt to maintain dignity before others' judgment. And in that suffocating silence, in that apparent distance, something subtle began to form, a connection that neither of them dared to admit, but that slowly insinuated itself, preparing the ground for changes that would transform not only that marriage, but their lives forever. The couple's routine began to reveal unexpected nuances. Each gesture of hers, no matter how small, carried a sincerity that he didn't expect. She didn't fake affection, didn't seek immediate rewards or public recognition. She just did what seemed right, offering attention, care, and respect, even before his cold silence. She prepared his meals carefully, organized his clothes, accompanied him discreetly to appointments without ever asking invasive questions, and her constant behavior began to slowly dissolve the barrier of distrust he had erected. He watched in silence, trying to decipher each look, each gesture, each small act of kindness. It was different from everything he had ever experienced. Never had anyone treated him with genuine respect, without expecting anything in return, without interest in his wealth or position. That woman, who entered his life out of desperation, was showing something he had long forgotten, that the value of a person isn't measured by what they possess, but by the capacity to care, understand, and see beyond the surface. With each passing day, he noticed subtleties that previously escaped him. The way she organized the library books, The way she remembered small details from their conversations, the care with which she adjusted his suit clothes, without ever questioning or imposing herself. He began to wonder if all the time he isolated himself in his distrust and pride hadn't been in vain. For the first time, he felt that someone truly saw him, not as a powerful CEO, not as a rich or disabled man, but as someone worthy of attention and affection for what he was. And each gesture of hers, apparently simple, resonated forcefully in his mind, breaking barriers he believed insurmountable. He was surprised by the effect that woman had on him, with the patience and kindness that each day revealed themselves more authentic. It was as if, little by little, he began to realize that what he had always sought in life, true love, someone who would see beyond appearances, finally emerged before him, disguised as an ordinary woman, but with extraordinary courage and sincerity. She, for her part, also noticed changes. His cold silence began to be interrupted by small conversations, by discreet questions about her day, by comments that demonstrated attention and genuine interest. The way he leaned in to listen, the way his eyes now met hers for longer instants than before, created a silent tension, loaded with meaning. She felt she was reaching something deep, that her patience, her courage, and her care didn't go unnoticed. And even without fully understanding what was happening, she began to realize that this marriage, which before seemed just a cold contract, was beginning to transform into something more complex, more human, more intense. Each small advance in their relationship was like a spark that ignited a silent flame, preparing the ground for future revelations, for emotional changes that neither of them could avoid. In those moments of mutual care and silent observation, the impossible began to insinuate itself. The perception that, behind the facade of convenience, something genuine was being born. The night was silent, almost supernatural. When she entered the living room to leave some fresh flowers she had brought from the garden, the moonlight came through the windows, projecting long shadows on the polished wooden floor. She expected to find her husband sitting, as always, immersed in the cold silence that dominated that imposing house. But, to her total surprise, he was standing, walking with a lightness, a firmness and a balance that completely contradicted what she believed until then. Each step was sure, each movement natural. Her heart raced, and for an instant, time seemed to freeze again. It was impossible. The man she knew as someone fragile and dependent now moved with complete autonomy. The shock was almost physical, and the mixture of disbelief and anger grew with each second. The silence that before suffocated now transformed into questions that spun in her mind like an uncontrollable whirlwind. She could barely breathe. Every detail she had believed before, his exaggerated care, the supposed limitation, the rigorous silence, now revealed itself to be a carefully constructed illusion. He watched her, with that intense gaze that mixed expectation and slight amusement, almost challenging her to react. "So, what do you think now?" he asked, his voice calm, but loaded with meaning. The weight of his words made her swallow hard, trying to find an answer that wouldn't betray the mixture of shock, indignation, and curiosity that dominated her. She remembered all the nights she had sacrificed herself, all the care offered without expecting anything in return, the infinite patience she had before his silence. And at that instant, she realized that all of it had been a test, a planned farce to prove the sincerity of her intentions, to discover if someone would be capable of seeing him beyond appearances and the contract that united them. The mixture of anger and admiration grew inside her. On one hand, she felt humiliated, betrayed, as if each gesture of care had been used against her. On the other, she couldn't help but recognize the intelligence and control he had exercised during all that time. Everything was planned, each look, each silence, each test of patience and kindness. And, above all, he hadn't deceived her just to humiliate her, but to prove a point that, otherwise, perhaps would never have been understood. He needed to be sure that she could love him without knowing who he really was, without being influenced by power, wealth, or status. And at that instant, in the cold of the night illuminated by the moon, she understood the magnitude of the situation. It wasn't just about a marriage for money, nor a reunion from the past. It was about an emotional test, a game of trust and authenticity, and they were about to discover that the line between love, revenge, and redemption was thinner than anyone could imagine. The atmosphere between them, which until then was loaded with silent tension, exploded in cutting words that night. She entered the living room, her eyes red from frustration and pain, each muscle tense, each breath measured. "How could you?" she said, her voice trembling, mixing anger and disbelief. "You played with my life, with my feelings, with everything I did for you. I took care of you. I dedicated myself without expecting anything. And you deceived me." The words echoed through the hall, cutting through the heavy silence that had extended between them since the beginning of the marriage. He remained standing, motionless, his gaze fixed on her, absorbing each phrase, each accusation, each emotion she poured out without filter. For the first time, both were vulnerable, exposing wounds that had been silently cultivated over years of pain and distance. She felt betrayed, but also confused. How could someone she still loved so much, at the same time, hurt her so deliberately? He took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was softer, almost melancholic. "I needed to be sure of something," he said, looking directly into her eyes, as if trying to transmit each nuance of truth and sincerity. "I couldn't trust anyone, not even myself. I needed to see if someone could love me without knowing who I am, without seeing my position, my fortune, or my family. I needed to be sure that there existed someone capable of seeing beyond the facade, someone capable of loving the man I still am, even hidden, even in silence." Each word of his fell like a powerful wave over her. The anger began to mix with disbelief, and gradually, a thread of understanding began to form. Was it cruel? Yes, but it was also the most intense proof that he, in some distorted way, valued something she had never imagined could exist in that cold world: emotional authenticity, true loyalty and kindness without interest. She sat down, tired, as if all the weight of the world had fallen on her shoulders at once. Her heart still beat fast, but now there was a mixture of understanding and confusion. For years, she believed that man had left her life by his own choice, leaving an impossible void to fill. And now, before the cruel and at the same time exciting truth, she realized that everything was part of a greater plan, an experience that tested not only her sincerity, but the capacity of both to recognize and accept real feelings amid deceptions and appearances. Emotions mixed: frustration, pain, old love resurfacing, and a strange sensation that, finally, they were about to understand what it really meant to love someone without prejudices, without interests, and without masks. The farce, cruel as it was, had revealed something that no contract could ever teach: that true human connection transcends appearances, power, and social conventions. The day when the truth finally exploded didn't begin with any fanfare, but quickly transformed into a hurricane of attention and speculation. Newspapers, magazines, and television stations began to investigate, driven by the rumors running through the city and social media. And what before seemed like a normal marriage, with impeccable protocol and attentive guests, became a headline within hours. Photographs of the couple appeared on covers, accompanied by sensationalist titles: "Bride Deceived by Mysterious Millionaire," "The Wedding That Shocked the City," and "How a $5 million Contract Became a Farce." The young woman, who until then remained firm, now saw her name being questioned, her reputation stained by hasty judgments and cruel comments. She felt the weight of looks that before admired her, but now carried doubt, criticism, and judgment. Each step she took in public seemed to be followed by whispers and malicious comments, reminding her that the world could be quick to condemn, but slow to understand. While the media and public opinion tried to decipher the scandal, he made a decision that surprised everyone. Amid camera flashes and extended microphones, he positioned himself at the front of the confusion, taking responsibility for the deception that transformed their lives into a spectacle. His firm voice, but loaded with sincerity, cut through the murmur: "Yes, I was the one who deceived. I planned everything to discover who could love me without knowing who I was. No one else besides her saw my truth from the beginning. She didn't know and shouldn't have known. The only intention was to test her sincerity, kindness, and courage, and the truth is that she passed all the tests, even without understanding the farce." The words resonated like thunder in the public square, breaking prejudices and expectations, and the young woman felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment. On one hand, the stain on her name still persisted. on the other. His confession had cleared part of the injustice that weighed on her, revealing that she was never guilty of the farce, but rather a victim of a carefully architected situation. The reaction of the people around was a mixture of shock, admiration, and disbelief. That man, known for his coldness, wealth, and absolute control over everything he touched, had publicly exposed his own strategy, taking responsibility for the scandal, and by doing so, transformed everyone's perception. She, still in shock, realized that each contained tear, each silent gesture of patience, and each proof of kindness she offered throughout the marriage had not only been recognized, but now carried a greater meaning, a weight that transcended superficial judgments. The headlines would continue to circulate. The murmur wouldn't cease. But there, at that moment, she and he shared a deep understanding. That truth, even if late and painful, could liberate, repair, and show the value of love and trust. And while the flashes continued to fire and the city tried to digest that scandal, both knew that story was far from over, and that the next decisions, silent or public, would still define the paths of connection that began with deception, but now showed itself loaded with genuine, unexpected, and transformative emotions. Months passed since the scandal that shook the city and completely transformed both their lives. She, determined to move away from the shadow of judgments and the pressure of a wealth she didn't feel was hers, decided to refuse the contract money, returning what she no longer needed, as a silent gesture of independence and dignity. She returned to the small town of her childhood, to that simple routine that before seemed limited, but now offered freedom and space to breathe, to reflect, to rediscover who she was without masks or contracts. Each step she took, each decision made, carried the weight and experience that taught her to distinguish between interest and authenticity, between manipulation and genuine care. Even surrounded by challenges and uncertainties, there was a feeling of lightness, a sensation of reconstruction, because, for the first time in years, she felt owner of herself, capable of choosing her own path without depending on anyone's approval. While she tried to resume her life, he watched from afar, reflecting on everything that had happened. For months, he evaluated his own actions, the tests he had created, the risk of having hurt someone who was always special to him. But now, he understood that everything had been necessary to reveal the truth, not only about her, but about himself. The love he felt was no longer a memory of the past, was no longer hidden by masks or power games. He learned that the value of true love isn't measured by wealth, appearance, or convenience, but by the capacity to see the other in their essence, to accept their vulnerabilities and share genuine moments, even when no one is watching. And it was exactly for that reason that he decided to look for her, not as a powerful millionaire he had always been, but as a simple man with clear feelings, willing to be seen and loved for what he was, without illusions or strategies. The reunion was silent, but loaded with meaning. She saw him approach, not with luxurious suits or imposing cars, but with the simplicity and sincerity of someone who learned from life that the most important thing isn't to impress, but to truly connect. He didn't bring contracts nor promises of wealth. He brought words, gestures, and a presence that spoke more than any wealth could express. Looking at him, she felt something she hadn't felt since first love: security, respect, and a deep emotional connection, free from interests or appearances. And at that instant, they understood together that this story, which began with deception, contracts, and secrets, had transformed into something much greater, a lesson about patience, empathy, authenticity, and the strength of a love that proves itself in action and genuine care. The past, which before seemed like a painful shadow, became a bridge to an unexpected future, where both, finally free from masks and burdens, could build something true, solid, and exciting, reminding everyone that life, even when unfair, can offer extraordinary surprises for those with the courage to believe in love. This story shows us that not always what seems to be real is true, and that the value of people goes far beyond what is seen at first glance. It challenges us to reflect on our own choices. Are you allowing fear, pride, or momentary interest to guide your life? Or are you willing to see beyond appearances and value authenticity, kindness, and genuine love that are often hidden right in front of us? Think about your relationships, your judgments, and the way you deal with opportunities and challenges. Are you opening space for real connections or letting yourself be deceived by contracts and social masks? If this story inspired you, subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and follow more narratives that challenge your perception, stir your emotions, and make you reflect on life, love, and the choices that really matter.